The maintenance bulletin board had 3 new names taped over his, and Nathan Boyd stood reading them in his work boots, coffee going cold in his hand. Tyler Combs. He knew that name. He had known it for 8 years, since a training floor 2 states away, since a young man who almost failed a certification and didn't. Around him the morning shift kept moving, nobody noticing the one man who wasn't moving at all. Above the names, in bold red letters, Highline Safety Training, new certified experts. He set the coffee down. He didn't say a word. Before the truth comes out in that training room, ask yourself something. How many people standing quietly around you are more than the job they're doing right now? The Highline Aerostructures plant sat on the east side of Tulsa, a long gray building with airplane parts moving down its lines like something alive. Nathan had worked the night maintenance shift there for 3 years, and most people who passed him in the hallway knew him only as the quiet guy who fixed the equipment and kept his head down. He liked it that way. Quiet didn't ask questions. Quiet didn't need explaining. The city had been good to him in a way he hadn't expected when he first moved. Tulsa didn't ask where a man had come from before, only whether he showed up on time and did the work well when he got there. That suited him fine. He rented a small house near a school with a decent rating, kept the yard mowed, kept his head down, and built a life that fit inside those boundaries without anyone asking too many questions about the years before. Claire Dawson had been vice president of operations for 6 weeks. She was 34, sharp in a way that made junior engineers straighten their posture without meaning to, and she had come to Highline from a corporate office in Dallas with a mandate to fix what leadership called training inconsistency. That morning, she stood at the front of the main floor and told 200 employees that the plant would be bringing in outside experts from the National Aviation Safety Institute to overhaul the composite repair certification program. "We want the best," she said. "That's not a criticism of anyone currently doing the work. It's an investment in where we're going." Nathan listened from the back, arms crossed, saying nothing. He had heard versions of that sentence before, in a different building, a different year. It hadn't ended well for him then either. Around him, men and women he'd worked beside for 3 years traded glances, some curious, some already halfway to indifferent. Training programs came and went at plants like this. Consultants came and went. Most people on the floor had learned not to invest too much feeling in either. After the meeting, his supervisor pulled him aside. Since Nathan was already responsible for maintaining the training lab's equipment, the mock fuselage sections, the diagnostic tools, the projector, nobody could ever get to work right. It made sense, administratively, for him to support logistics during the new sessions. Nobody was trying to humiliate him. Nobody even remembered enough about him to want to. "You'll set up the room, run the equipment, that kind of thing," his supervisor said. "Should be straightforward." Nathan nodded. "Sure." That evening, he picked up his daughter from the after-school program at Riverside Elementary. Maddie was 9, all elbows and questions, and she talked the entire drive home about a science project involving a volcano that had, in her words, worked way better than the teacher expected. "Did you have a good day, Dad?" she asked, when she finally paused for breath. "It was fine," Nathan said. "Long. You always say that." "Because it's always true." She laughed, and for a few minutes the plant and the bulletin board and the 3 new names taped over the space where his used to be didn't matter at all. That was the thing about Maddie. She had a way of making the rest of it go quiet. Later, after she was asleep, Nathan sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he didn't drink and a folder from work he didn't open. The house was quiet in the way it only got after 9, the refrigerator humming, a neighbor's dog barking twice somewhere down the street, and then giving up. He kept thinking about the names on that board. 2 of them meant nothing to him. The third one had a face attached to it, a face he hadn't seen in 8 years, and he wasn't ready yet to decide what that meant. He thought about calling someone from the old days just to ask if it was really him, and then thought better of it. Some questions answered themselves if you gave them enough time. The box had been in the back of the garage for 3 years, behind a shelf of paint cans and a bicycle Maddie had outgrown. Nathan pulled it down on a Tuesday night after she was asleep, sat on the concrete floor, and opened it like it might bite him. Inside was a laminated instructor badge with his photo on it, 10 years younger, no gray at his temples yet. A certification plaque from the National Aviation Safety Institute, Master Trainer, Composite Repair Systems. And underneath that, a spiral notebook with a cracked blue cover, his old class roster, names and signatures of every trainee who had passed under his supervision, going back 9 years. He remembered building that curriculum from nothing but field notes and a decade of watching things go wrong on hangar floors from Georgia to Washington State. He remembered the long nights writing test scenarios, the arguments with administrators who wanted the certification track shortened, the satisfaction of watching a room of nervous 20-somethings turn into people who could catch a hairline fracture before it became a headline. He flipped to the page from 8 years ago. Tyler Combs passed on the second attempt, after Nathan stayed 2 hours late one Thursday night walking him through a joint inspection technique the boy kept rushing. Nathan remembered it clearly now, the kid's hands shaking, the relief on his face when it finally clicked. He hadn't written the Highline certification program. Not exactly. But he had written the one it was based on, the one the Institute still used, the one that had trained probably a third of the composite repair specialists working in American aerospace right now. He had built it after a decade of field work, refined it over 5 years of teaching, and signed off on hundreds of students who had gone on to careers he mostly never heard about again. He closed the notebook. He didn't tell Denise Ortiz, who ran training coordination and was the only person at Highline who knew any real version of his history. He didn't tell his supervisor. He put the box back behind the paint cans and went to bed, and in the morning, he went to work like any other day. Denise had learned the broad strokes of his file 2 years earlier, during a routine background check that had flagged an inconsistency between his stated job history and his actual qualifications. She'd asked him about it once, carefully, over coffee in the break room. He'd given her enough of the truth to satisfy her without opening the whole thing up, and she had respected the boundaries since, even when it made her job harder than it needed to be. The schedule came out the next afternoon. The first full certification session, the real one, with the whole production floor invited to observe, along with Claire and Regional Director Paul Kessler, was set for the following Monday. Nathan's name was on the logistics list. Room setup, equipment checks, projector. He read it twice, then went back to work. If a courtroom needed a witness to a man's whole career, it would ask for documents, testimony, a paper trail. What Nathan had was a notebook nobody had opened yet. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't come from him volunteering the truth. It would come from someone else finding it, or remembering it themselves. Monday morning, the training room at Highline filled up faster than Nathan expected. Folding chairs lined the back wall, and the front held 3 tables set with laptops, sample composite panels, and a banner reading Highline Certification Program, National Aviation Safety Institute Partnership. Nathan came in an hour early to check the projector, run the extension cords, and set the mock fuselage section in the center of the floor where the cameras from corporate communications wanted it. He had trimmed his beard the night before, though he told himself it had nothing to do with anything. He was still in his gray maintenance uniform, the one with his last name stitched over the pocket, when Tyler Combs walked in with 2 other instructors and a rolling case of equipment. Tyler looked good, confident, in a pressed button down, the kind of posture that came from years of standing in front of rooms. He didn't look toward the back of the space, where a man in work clothes was crouched behind a folding table checking a power strip. Why would he? 8 years and a beard and a maintenance uniform were enough distance for most people not to look twice. Claire arrived a few minutes before 9, scanning the room the way she scanned everything, cataloging who was where and what needed fixing. She caught Nathan's eye once across the room, gave a short nod. He returned it. Neither of them said anything. They rarely did, beyond the necessary. She had noticed him before, in the way a person in charge notices someone who quietly makes their job easier. A projector that always worked. A room that was always ready 5 minutes early. She hadn't put a name to the noticing yet. Only a vague sense that something about the maintenance department was running better than it had any obvious reason to. The session began. Tyler took the lead, walking the floor through an overview of updated inspection protocols, and Nathan noticed things nobody else in the room would have caught. A phrase here, a rhythm there, the exact way Tyler paused before saying, check twice, cut once, a line Nathan had used in every class he ever taught. It wasn't imitation. It was inheritance. Tyler didn't know he was quoting anyone. Partway through the session, a young technician named Reyes raised his hand and asked a pointed question about moisture ingress in a specific panel type, a scenario that didn't come up often but mattered when it did. The 3 instructors exchanged a glance. One of them started an answer, backed off it, Tried again. Tyler jumped in with something close, but not quite complete. From the back of the room, Nathan said nothing. He knew the answer cold. He also knew better than to offer it. It wasn't his session, and volunteering a correction from the back of the room, however quietly, was the kind of thing that ended careers faster than it fixed them. He'd learned that lesson too, once, though the circumstances had been different. Claire watched the exchange longer than she needed to. She filed it away without knowing exactly what she was filing. That evening, Maddie wanted to know if his new job was fun. "It's fine," Nathan said, setting a plate of spaghetti in front of her. "Different. Different good or different bad?" He thought about it. "Different quiet," he said, and let that be the whole answer. Maddie didn't push further. She had a 9-year-old's instinct for when a conversation had reached its natural edge, and instead launched into a detailed account of a kickball game at recess that had apparently ended in controversy over a foul line nobody could agree on. Nathan listened, grateful for the noise, grateful for a version of his day that had nothing to do with bulletin boards or borrowed phrases said by a stranger who used to be his student. A week went by. Paul Kessler, the regional director overseeing 3 Highline facilities, came through on a Wednesday to review budget lines with Claire, and one of the items on the sheet was the maintenance department's headcount. "We're overstaffed on the internal side now that training's been outsourced," Kessler said. "I want to see that line trimmed by the end of the quarter." Claire looked over the numbers. "Nathan Boyd runs point-on equipment for that department. He's the one keeping the training lab functional. So we'll find him something else to do, or we won't," Kessler said. "That's not really the conversation I came here for." There was something in the way he said it, flat and dismissive, that Claire noted without commenting on. She'd worked with enough men like Kessler to know the tone wasn't really about budget lines. Kessler had run 3 regional facilities in 12 years, and he had a reputation for treating headcount the way other men treated sports scores, something to be managed, trimmed, argued over without much thought for the individual names behind the numbers. Claire had heard that about him before she transferred in. She was starting to see why people said it. Later that day, she found Nathan in the training lab, adjusting a sensor on the mock fuselage panel that had been reading inconsistent since the last session. "You fixed that in under 10 minutes, she said. "The vendor told us it would take a service visit." "Vendor doesn't want to drive out here for a loose wire," Nathan said, not looking up. "You do a lot of things around here that aren't really your job description." He shrugged. "Somebody has to." She almost asked him something else, a real question, the kind that would have required a real answer. But Kessler's voice carried down the hallway calling her name, and the moment passed. She filed the impulse away with the rest of what she'd noticed about Nathan Boyd, a small stack of details that hadn't yet added up to anything she could name. Outside, near the loading dock, Nathan crossed paths with Kessler directly for the first time since the reorganization was announced. Kessler looked at him the way people look at furniture. "You're the maintenance guy who used to run some kind of training thing," Kessler said. It wasn't a question. "Long time ago, I heard." "A while back," Nathan said. "Things change." Kessler kept walking. Nathan stood there a moment, jaw tight, then went back inside. He didn't mention the exchange to anyone, including Denise Ortiz, who caught him afterward in the break room and asked if everything was all right. "Fine," he said. Denise studied him a second longer than the word deserved. She knew more about his file than she was supposed to, enough to know that fine rarely meant fine when Nathan said it that way. But her hands were tied by exactly the kind of paperwork that had buried his history in the first place, and she let it go, because that was what her position required of her, even when it cost her something to do it. She refilled her coffee and watched him head back toward the training lab, thinking, not for the first time, that there was a version of this building where the org chart made sense and the right people ended up in the right rooms. This wasn't that building, not yet, and she wasn't sure how many more quiet Fridays it would take before that stopped feeling like something she could live with. The second full certification session drew a bigger crowd. Corporate had sent a regional safety compliance officer down from headquarters to observe, a woman named Patricia Yoon who took notes on a tablet and said very little. Claire stood near the front. Kessler stood near the door, arms crossed, checking his phone more than the room. The stakes felt different that morning, though nobody said so out loud. A compliance visit changed the temperature of any room, and even Tyler, usually loose and confident in front of an audience, seemed to be measuring his words a little more carefully than the week before. One of the other instructors, a man named Corey Fletcher, was demonstrating a joint inspection technique on a composite panel with a hairline stress fracture built into the training model. It was meant to simulate a subtle failure point, the kind that was easy to miss if you rushed the process. Corey rushed the process. He skipped a step in the pressure test sequence, the exact shortcut that years ago, on a real aircraft, had led to a structural failure serious enough to ground a fleet and end careers. Nathan felt his whole body go still. He knew what came next in the demonstration if nobody corrected it. He knew because he had watched it happen for real, once, and had spent 8 years living with what that cost him. He stepped forward from where he'd been checking a cable line and said, quietly but clearly, "You want to rerun the tap test before you sign off on that joint. Skipping it is how you miss a subsurface delamination." The room turned. Corey blinked, caught between correcting himself and being corrected by a man in a maintenance uniform. He reran the test. The panel failed it, exactly as Nathan expected. A murmur moved through the crowd. Patricia Yoon looked up from her tablet for the first time all morning. Pen paused mid-sentence, watching the panel fail the test that should have caught it the first time. Corey Fletcher's face had gone a shade paler. He was a decent instructor, careful most days, but the pressure of an audience and a compliance officer had pushed him to skip a step he would never have skipped alone in a quiet room. That was, Nathan knew from long experience, exactly how most preventable failures happened. Not from ignorance, from rushing. He'd seen the same pattern once before, years ago, on a real fuselage instead of a training model, in a hangar 3 states away. Nobody had been standing close enough that time to catch it before it became a headline. He'd learned to live with that memory the way people learn to live with old injuries, mostly forgotten, until the weather changed. Tyler, standing a few feet away, had gone very still. He knew that phrase, tap test before sign-off. He had heard it 100 times, years ago, in a different room, from a man who used to say it exactly like that, with exactly that flat patience. Claire, near the front, hadn't caught the phrase's history, only the authority behind it. The way the whole room had straightened up and gone quiet at a single correction from a man in a maintenance uniform. She made a note to ask someone about him later, though she wasn't sure yet what the question would be. He turned and looked at Nathan directly for the first time since he'd walked into the building. Really looked. The beard, the uniform, the eyes he hadn't forgotten, no matter how many years had passed. Patricia Yoon was already making a note on her tablet. A near miss, flagged for mandatory review. Standard procedure anytime a safety critical error surfaced in a certification environment with corporate observers present. That review would happen. It was not optional. Nobody in that room, least of all Nathan, understood yet how much it would end up deciding. The session was supposed to continue. Tyler was supposed to move on to the next demonstration. Instead, he set down the panel he was holding, stepped off the small platform at the front of the room, and walked straight toward the back where Nathan stood. The room noticed. Conversations died out one by one as people turned to watch a certified instructor cross an entire training floor toward the maintenance man nobody had paid much attention to all morning. 200 pairs of eyes followed the same slow arc, and the silence that gathered behind Tyler's footsteps had a weight to it, the kind that made even the forklifts on the far side of the plant feel far away. "Wait," Tyler said, stopping a few feet from him, voice unsteady in a way that didn't match his usual polish. "Instructor Boyd?" Nathan didn't answer right away. There wasn't really a way to unask a question like that in front of 200 people. "It's you," Tyler said. "It's actually you." "It's me," Nathan said quietly. Tyler turned to the room, half in disbelief, like he needed witnesses to make it real. "This is Nathan Boyd," he said. "He was my instructor at the Institute. 8 years ago. He certified me. He certified." Tyler stopped, looked at his 2 colleagues near the front, both of whom had gone pale. "He certified all 3 of us." Silence dropped over the training floor like a sheet pulled tight. "The program we're teaching," Tyler said, quieter now, mostly to Nathan, though everyone could hear it. "The one Highline paid the Institute for. You wrote the original version of this, didn't you?" Nathan looked at him for a long moment. "Wrote most of it," he said. "Institute updated it some since." "You stayed 2 hours late for me once," Tyler said. "The joint inspection test. I almost failed it. You wouldn't let me leave until I had it right." "I remember," Nathan said. Near the front, Claire stood frozen, the pieces reordering themselves faster than she could track. Kessler had gone rigid by the door, his jaw set, a man doing quiet arithmetic on what this meant for him. "Why didn't you say anything?" Tyler asked, and there was no accusation in it, only genuine confusion. "Wasn't my job to say anything," Nathan said. "Just to fix the projector." Nobody laughed. It wasn't really a joke. The other two instructors had come forward by then, standing a step behind Tyler, both of them looking at Nathan with the same expression, recognition slowly arriving, followed by something like embarrassment for having walked past him in that hallway all week without once looking twice. Denise, standing near the equipment table, exhaled slowly, like something she'd been holding for a long time had finally been set down by someone else's hand instead of her own. She had carried that secret carefully for 2 years, and there was a strange relief in watching it come apart in front of a room full of witnesses instead of in a private conversation she would have had to answer for alone. Kessler had already turned and walked out the side door before the room finished absorbing what had happened, his phone already at his ear, his voice low and clipped as the door swung shut behind him. That night, at home, Maddie asked why Nathan seemed distracted during dinner. "Long day," he said. "You said that already." "It's still true," he said, and managed something close to a smile, even though his mind was still standing in that room, watching 200 faces turn toward him at once. The session ended early. It had to. Nobody in that room could pretend to focus on inspection protocols after what had just happened in front of them, and Claire made the call to dismiss everyone 20 minutes in. By early afternoon, word had moved through the plant the way word always did, faster than any memo, twisted a little more with every retelling. By the time it reached the far end of the production floor, some versions had Nathan as a former astronaut, or a man who'd once designed parts for a fighter jet program that didn't officially exist. The truth, when Denise finally sat down with Claire in her office to lay it out plainly, was strange enough without the exaggeration, and in some ways harder to hear. He was let go from the Institute 8 years ago, Denise said. Officially, it was a restructuring. Unofficially, he refused to sign off on an accelerated certification track that leadership wanted pushed through faster than the safety protocol allowed. 6 months later, a repair failure grounded a fleet. He'd flagged that exact risk in writing before it happened. Claire sat with that, and nobody thought that was worth mentioning when we hired his own former program back into this building. Nobody connected it, Denise said. His personnel file here doesn't mention any of it. It's a maintenance file. That's all it was ever supposed to be. Kessler, called into the same meeting an hour later, didn't deny any of it once the documents were on the table. Nathan's old certification records, the notebook Denise had finally handed over, the Institute's own restructuring paperwork with Kessler's name on the approval chain from years earlier, back when he'd held a different title at a different facility. The past doesn't change the current staffing structure, Kessler said, arms crossed. He's a maintenance technician here. That was the role he applied for. That's the role he has. He built the program your consultants are getting paid to teach, Claire said. You knew that, didn't you? Back then. Kessler didn't answer directly. I knew there was a dispute. I wasn't in a position to overrule the decision that was made. You signed the decision, Claire said, sliding the paperwork an inch closer to him. He said nothing else. Claire watched him leave the office without another word, the folder of documents still open on the table between them, and felt the particular kind of anger that comes from realizing a decision made years ago by someone else had been quietly costing a good employee ever since, with nobody in a position to fix it until now. That evening, Claire sat alone in her office long after the plant had emptied, the folder of documents open in front of her, and thought about a man who had spent 3 years fixing projectors and loose wires without once mentioning any of it. She thought about the 200 faces in that room, the way Tyler's voice had cracked saying his name. She thought, too, about her own reaction, standing frozen at the front of the room, not shock exactly, or not only shock. Something closer to recognition, the specific kind that comes when a person you've been quietly noticing turns out to be more than you let yourself consider. At home, Nathan tucked Maddie in and sat with her a few extra minutes, saying nothing about the day, letting her tell him instead about a friend's birthday party coming up on Saturday, and whether a bounce house was, in her expert opinion, better than a face painter. It was the kind of ordinary conversation he needed more than he would have admitted to anyone, a small anchor after a day that had pulled loose almost everything he'd spent 8 years keeping tied down. The safety review convened 5 days later in a conference room on the second floor, the same one used for quarterly earnings calls and the occasional union negotiation. Patricia Yoon sat at the head of the table with 2 colleagues from corporate compliance. Claire sat to her left. Kessler sat across from them, jaw tight, a legal pad in front of him that stayed mostly blank the entire meeting. Nathan was asked to present the technical findings on the near miss. How the shortcut in the pressure test sequence could have allowed a subsurface delamination to pass inspection undetected, what the failure mode would have looked like downstream, why the specific corrective step mattered enough to interrupt a live certification session in front of 200 people. He spoke plainly, the way he always had in front of a room, years of habit surfacing without effort. Diagrams, numbers, cause and effect. Patricia Yoon asked 2 follow-up questions. He answered both without hesitation, and for a few minutes the conference room stopped feeling like a hearing and started feeling like exactly what it should have been from the beginning. A room listening to the person most qualified to explain what had almost gone wrong. For the record, she said afterward, how are you certified to identify this failure mode with this level of specificity? I wrote the original detection protocol for the Institute, Nathan said. 9 years ago. Composite repair systems, master trainer level. Tyler, seated near the back at Claire's request, stood without being asked. I can confirm that, he said. He trained me. He trained the 2 instructors sitting next to me. The certification program currently running at this facility is built on his original coursework. Kessler tried once, weakly, to argue that historical authorship of a training document had no bearing on current staffing decisions. Nobody at the table found that argument worth much, least of all Patricia Yoon, who noted for the record that Highline's leadership had allowed a documented safety expert to be reassigned to equipment maintenance while his own program was outsourced back to the facility at significant cost, without anyone catching the redundancy. She asked, more than once, how a personnel file could go 8 years without a single flag on any of it, and nobody at the table had a satisfying answer. The vote at the end of the review wasn't about punishment. It was about corrective action, restoring qualified oversight to the certification program going forward. 6 of the 7 voting members present supported reinstating Nathan Boyd as lead safety trainer for the Highline facility, with full authority over the program. Kessler cast the only dissenting vote, and everyone in the room understood exactly why. Afterward, in the hallway outside the conference room, Claire waited without quite admitting to herself that she was waiting. When Nathan came out, tie-less, uniform still on because he hadn't thought to change, she didn't say anything about the vote or the program or Kessler. She just looked at him a beat longer than professional distance required, and something passed between them that neither one of them had a name for yet. Down the hall, a few employees who'd caught wind of the outcome slowed as they passed, offering small nods of their own, the kind of quiet acknowledgement that meant more coming from people who worked the floor than any formal announcement would have. Congratulations, she finally said. Thanks, Nathan said. Wasn't expecting today to go like that. Neither was I, Claire said, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Highline, she let herself smile at him without checking whether it was appropriate first. Kessler was reassigned to a regional role in Wichita within 3 weeks, a transfer his own file described as a lateral move, and everyone else in the building understood as something closer to an exit. Nobody threw a party about it. Nobody needed to. Nathan's new office was smaller than the one Kessler had vacated, tucked at the end of the training wing with a window that looked out over the employee parking lot. He didn't ask for anything bigger. He hung the old certification plaque on the wall, the one that had spent 3 years behind paint cans, and left it at that. He kept the desk mostly bare, the way he liked it, one framed photo of Maddie facing the door, so he'd see her first thing every morning. Tyler and the 2 other instructors stayed on, now working directly under him instead of around him, and something in the dynamics settled into place that felt less like correction and more like coming home. The sessions ran smoother almost immediately, fewer stumbled answers, fewer moments where a technician's sharp question caught the room off guard, because now there was someone in the room who had written the answers in the first place. Tyler asked him once, a few weeks in, why he'd never mentioned any of it. Not once. Not even after the second session when the truth was sitting right there in the room with them. Would have changed how people treated me, Nathan said. Wasn't sure I wanted that yet. Do you now? Nathan considered it. Ask me again in a year. Claire found him after hours one evening, the plant mostly empty, just the hum of overhead lights and the distant sound of a forklift somewhere on the far side of the floor. She'd brought 2 coffees, handed him one without asking if he wanted it. I read your old case file today, she said. The real one, not the maintenance version. Figured you would eventually. You could have fought it back then. The Institute's decision. You had grounds. Didn't feel like fighting, Nathan said. Felt like getting my daughter through the year. Priorities shift. Claire nodded slowly, like that answer settled something she'd been turning over for days. For what it's worth, she said, I'm glad you didn't leave the industry entirely. Wasn't sure I had, Nathan said. Guess I hadn't really. Just been keeping the lights on somewhere quieter. They stood there a moment longer than either conversation or silence strictly required, coffee going lukewarm in their hands, neither one in a hurry to be the first to walk away. Outside, the last of the daylight caught the parking lot in long amber stripes, and somewhere past the fence line a train sounded its horn twice, the way it did most evenings around that hour, familiar enough now that neither of them turned to notice it. The next Saturday, Maddie ran into Claire in the parking lot outside the plant, waiting for Nathan to finish a late shift. She didn't know who Claire was beyond a friendly adult who worked with her dad, and she said hello with the easy confidence of a 9-year-old who hadn't yet learned to be careful with strangers. You work with my dad, Maddie said. He's really good at his job. Everybody says so now. They're right, Claire said, and meant it more than the sentence let on. 3 weeks later, the bulletin board outside the training wing had a new sheet posted at the top, laminated this time instead of taped. Lead safety trainer, composite repair certification, Nathan Boyd. Below it, in smaller print, 3 assisting instructor names, Tyler Combs listed first. The morning shift moved past it the way it moved past everything, most people too busy to stop and read. A few did stop. A few smiled without saying anything, the way people do when a small piece of the world has quietly corrected itself and nobody needs to make a speech about it. Reyes, the technician whose question had once left 3 instructors stumbling, paused long enough to read the whole thing twice before heading to his station, satisfied in some small way he couldn't quite name. Nathan walked the training room floor before the first session of the day, checking the same equipment he used to check as a formality, except now it was his floor to check because he'd chosen it, not because logistics had assigned it to him. Tyler was already there, setting up a new demonstration panel, and the two of them worked in the kind of easy silence that used to exist only in memory, 8 years old, in a different building, before either of their lives had detoured somewhere unexpected. Feels different, doesn't it? Tyler said, not looking up from the panel. Feels like it should have been this way the whole time, Nathan said, and Tyler, who had spent 8 years thinking of him only as a name on an old certificate, nodded like he understood exactly what that meant. Claire found him in the hallway outside the training room a little after 9, on her way to a meeting she was already going to be late for. She slowed instead of walking past. He noticed and slowed too. For a few seconds neither of them said anything at all, just a look, steady and unhurried, the kind that didn't need a sentence attached to it to mean something. She nodded once. He nodded back, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. Have a good one, she said. You too, he said. She kept walking. He watched her go for exactly as long as was reasonable and not 1 second longer, then turned back to the room full of people waiting to learn something he'd spent a decade learning himself, the hard way, in rooms nobody remembered his name in yet. That evening, Maddie waited for him by the front gate the way she did most Fridays, backpack slung over one shoulder, already talking before he was close enough to hear the beginning of the sentence. Claire crossed the parking lot a few yards behind them, heading to her car, and lifted a hand in a small wave that Nathan returned without breaking stride toward his daughter. The whole room, weeks ago, had needed only one voice to remember what everyone else had forgotten, that the quiet man in the corner had built the thing they were all standing inside of. It hadn't taken a trial, or a lawsuit, or a headline. It had taken one former student, walking across a floor, saying a name out loud, in a room full of strangers willing to stop and listen when he said it.